I'm Ben Harris, 32, working for a mid-level IT company in the suburbs. In many ways, my life was ordinary, at least until a couple of months ago. I was that guy who'd found the one, got married to her, settled into a neat little cookie-cutter routine, and joked about how the scariest thing in my world was traffic on the way to the office or the size of our mortgage. My wife, Lynn, is 29, a freelance editor who used to assist in a community college psych program. Though ironically, she always seemed squeamish around anything truly scary. Horror movies, haunted houses, even the mild spookiness of a Tim Burton animation made her uneasy. We'd been together for 6 years, newly married for 11 months. For the first 5.5 of those years, I would have bet my life that Lynn was the kind of person who'd never intentionally try to scare someone else. She was level-headed, sweet, the type who'd hush me if I jokingly brought up ghosts or something unnatural. In fact, I used to tease her about it. "You gotta lighten up, Lynn. Life's too short to avoid every horror flick." She'd just roll her eyes. We had a calm, steady relationship. Plenty of evenings cooking simple meals, clinking cheap wine glasses on the couch, or going to farmers markets on weekends. People said we were that nice, boring couple. Stable, no drama. We even moved to a pleasant suburb with tree-lined streets where neighbors occasionally wave hi in the mornings. Nothing about our lives suggested anything sinister. But 2 months ago, everything changed in the most unexpected, unnerving way. Lynn, who ordinarily hated pranks and who'd nearly had a meltdown years ago just from watching The Shining, suddenly started peeking at me. It wasn't the peekaboo cuteness you might imagine. It began as mild weirdness. Small glimpses of her face from behind a door, a corner, or over the top of the sofa. But as days passed, her actions became more and more disturbing, to the point where I can't even sleep a full night anymore. It's like she became something else. Giggling at odd times, lurking in corners with her eyes wide, or crawling across the floor as though possessed by some primal hunger. She never said why she was doing it. She never tried to justify it at all. It just started. And once it did, I realized how helpless I was in my own home, living with a person whose mind and body seemed hijacked. Even as I type this, I get waves of goosebumps, remembering every terrifying grin she gave me, every chill I got when I saw her head poke around a corner. This is the story of how it all unraveled, and how I discovered that sometimes the things we fear the most aren't from the outside. They're right next to us, wearing the face of the person we love. Started on a random Tuesday morning. I remember it was a day I'd slept through my alarm and needed to hustle. Usually, if I got up early enough, I'd swing by Dunkin' for coffee, but I was too far behind that day, so I brewed some quick coffee at home. Our house is a 2-story, built sometime in the 90s, with a hallway leading from the kitchen toward the front door. Nothing fancy. As I hurried out, coffee thermos in hand, I nearly dropped it when something popped into my peripheral vision. I froze. My eyes flicked to a spot just ahead, around the corner that connects the hallway to the living room. What I saw made my heart lurch. Just a sliver of Lynn's face, specifically one wide, unblinking eye peering from behind the wall, plus a lock of her dark hair trailing against the beige paint. The rest of her body was hidden. She looked like a child pulling a prank, except it was off. Her eyes seemed bright, almost too alert. "Lynn?" I said, forcing a laugh that came out shaky. "Jesus, you scared me. Are you messing around?" She slowly drew back out of sight. Then I heard a soft, scuttling shuffle, like she was half running, half crawling away. I stood there in stunned silence. Usually, she'd say something like, "Oh, sorry. Babe, didn't mean to scare you." But not this time. She just retreated with this half laugh, half giggle that echoed from the living room. I left, obviously freaked out but trying to brush it off. Maybe she's just feeling playful, I told myself in the car. I've told her a million times she's too serious, so maybe she's trying out a weird sense of humor. By lunch, I'd mostly forgotten the weirdness, focusing on deadlines at work. When I got home, Lynn acted perfectly normal. She asked about my day, gave me a quick kiss, complained about the mail carriers messing up our deliveries again. Nothing about the morning was mentioned. I felt uneasy but told myself not to be paranoid. She was probably pulling a silly prank. No big deal. A few days passed without anything unusual, and I let my guard down. Then, 3 nights later, around 2 a.m., I woke up uncomfortably thirsty, like I often do if I skip drinking water before bed. I lumbered downstairs, wearing only my boxers and an old t-shirt, heading to the kitchen to chug orange juice straight from the jug, one of my guilty habits. The house was silent except for our fridge's low hum. I flipped on the small overhead light. Suddenly, a heavy sense of being watched swept over me. You know that prickling, hair stands on end feeling? My gaze drifted downward, and there, near the base of the island, were 2 huge dark eyes, unblinking. Lynn was crouched on the other side of the island, peering up at me. Her mouth was stretched in a grin that looked more like a rictus. Her lips parted, but she said nothing. She was on all fours, hands and knees pressed to the tile, wearing an oversized t-shirt and possibly underwear. I couldn't see her lower half clearly behind the island, but I could hear the scrape of her fingernails or toenails on the floor. My brain froze. I let out a scream, almost dropping the OJ. She scuttled backward, still on all fours, her palms and bare feet smacking the tiles with these damp, slapping sounds. I can't describe how unnerving it was to see my wife move that way, like an insect or rodent startled by a bright light. Within a second or two, she'd backed out of the kitchen, disappearing into the darkness. I stood there, chest heaving, cold sweat trickling down my spine. I wanted to chase her or call out to her. Instead, I just stood paralyzed. Felt like stepping into a different reality. Lynn, the woman who hated scary pranks, was deliberately scaring the crap out of me. Finally, I forced myself to head upstairs. In the bedroom, the lights were off, but the moonlight coming through the curtains revealed Lynn in bed, lying on her side, breathing softly like she was asleep. My mind reeled. Could she have run that fast back upstairs and pretended to be asleep? Possibly, but it was so bizarre, so out of character that I questioned whether I was hallucinating. I lay down next to her, heart still pounding. She never stirred. Eventually, out of sheer exhaustion, I fell asleep. The next morning, I made 2 cups of coffee and set one on the counter for Lynn. When she came down, I gently asked, "Hey, about last night. Were you in the kitchen around 2 in the morning?" She raised an eyebrow. "At 2 in the morning? No, I was knocked out." I forced a laugh. "I guess I was half asleep. I could have sworn I saw you." Lynn gave me a playful grin, then teased, "You sure it wasn't a ghost? You do love horror. Maybe your mind is messing with you." The way she said it, lightly, made me think, wait, is she gaslighting me? Or is she genuinely unaware? I was too chicken to push further, so I just murmured, "Yeah, maybe," and let it go. But inside, I felt deeply unsettled. Could she have no recollection? Could she be sleepwalking? Or was she flat out lying? Over the next few days, I caught her peeking at me from behind the couch. One afternoon, I noticed a pair of eyes under the living room curtains, just the barest flash of her face. When I called her name, she darted away. None of it made sense. Each time, I felt that same surge of dread, the same dryness in my mouth, the same question pounding in my head. Why is she doing this? If the story ended with a few pranks, it would still be freaky. But it didn't. About a week later, I found Lynn inside an old trunk in our bedroom. This trunk originally belonged to her grandmother, a large wooden chest we kept at the foot of our bed to store blankets. I was folding laundry when I heard the trunk's antique hinges squeak. I froze. The trunk was slightly ajar. Curious and a bit tense, I walked over. Then I saw her face, half hidden by the heavy lid. She was staring up at me, expression wrapped like a kid playing hide and seek, grinning ear to ear in a strangely childlike yet menacing way. "Lynn," I stammered. "Why are you in there?" She said nothing, just let the lid drop closed with a muffled thump. I stood there in shock, eventually lifting the lid again, only to find the trunk empty. There was no false bottom or trapdoor, obviously. She somehow slid out the other side in that fraction of a second. That simple impossibility made my skin crawl. I couldn't pretend everything was normal anymore. My nerves were shot. Every time I turned a corner in my own home, I worried I'd see her half-face peeking back at me. By now, you might wonder, why didn't you just get out? Or drag her to a hospital? Believe me, the thought crossed my mind daily. But we'd been together for 6 years. I loved her. I kept rationalizing. Maybe she's going through a breakdown or trying to break her own fear of horror by ironically pranking me. We joked about her needing to lighten up for years, so maybe she was going overboard in some twisted way. Deep down, though, I suspected something else was going on. Something far darker than a prank spree. One evening while we were watching Netflix, I tried a different approach. Paused the show mid-episode. "Hey, you haven't been creeping on me lately?" I joked, forcing a light tone. She gave me a sidelong glance. "Maybe I've just gotten better at it," she replied with a playful smirk. Then she unpaused the show as if that statement was entirely normal. That night, I lay awake in bed, heart pounding like a hammer, scanning the darkness, expecting her to pop out from the closet or slip from under the bed. Every minute felt like an hour. Eventually, I must have dozed off, because I woke the next morning drenched in sweat, the sheet twisted around my legs. It was a Friday. Lynn said she'd head out around 7 p.m. to meet her friend Liz at a local wine bar. I seized the opportunity to have some me time, which basically meant lying on the couch, scrolling through Reddit, playing a few laptop games, and soaking in the quiet. By 9, I decided to take a long shower, a chance to unwind. Steam billowed around me, hot water cascading over my shoulders. For a while, it felt relaxing. Then, out of nowhere, I had the strongest sense I wasn't alone. I froze, every muscle tensing. Slowly, I opened my eyes. Lynn's entire head protruded from behind the shower curtain. Her hair clung to the plastic, soaked by the spray. The heavy black streaks of mascara ran down her cheeks, like she'd been crying or forcibly keeping her eyes open for a while. Her mouth stretched into a silent, too-wide grin, corners cracking. Her eyes were the scariest part, wide and red like she refused to blink. I yelled, jumping back so fast I banged my elbow on the tile. She stared at me, absolutely motionless for a few seconds. I managed to choke out, Lynn, what? She silently withdrew her head, backing away. A second later, the bathroom door slammed hard enough to rattle the mirror. I nearly slipped in the shower, adrenaline blasting through me, fear cutting deep. I stayed huddled in there, letting the hot water turn tepid, then cold. I kept the shower curtain pulled shut, terrified she was still in the bathroom. When, after half an hour, I finally dared to peek out, I saw no one. I locked the door from the inside, but then I heard a faint click from the closet door next to the sink, this tiny built-in closet we mostly used for towels. Realizing with horror she might be in the closet, I pressed my ear against the bathroom door to the hallway, also locked. I thought, she can't be both outside and in the closet, right? My thoughts spun. What if she never actually left? Fear paralyzed me. The last time I'd encountered her like this, she'd giggled or scuttled away, but this time felt more malicious. I pressed my ear to the closet, holding my breath. Nothing, only silence. Maybe I was being paranoid. Swallowing the lump in my throat, I braced myself. "Lynn, stop it. Enough." My voice echoed. No response. Finally, I stooped down to peek under the bathroom door leading to the hallway. I saw an empty strip of carpet and the top of the stairs in the distance. No sign of her. I was trembling all over but felt too humiliated to stay in the bathroom all night. So I unlocked it, yanked open the door, and that's when I heard a throaty moan from behind me, near the closet. My hair stood on end. My body jerked around involuntarily, and sure enough, the closet door was now cracked open about an inch. Inside, two wide eyes glowed with a sort of manic glee. My brain barely registered her facial expression before terror took over. Her mouth was parted in that inhuman grin, drool collecting at the edges. She pressed her fingers to her chest as if to stifle excited giggles, the closet's darkness framing her. And yes, she was in that closet the entire time. I tore open the bathroom door and bolted down the hallway. I could practically feel her behind me, but I didn't stop. Down the stairs, I snatched my phone and car keys off the living room table. I didn't even close the front door behind me, just jumped into my car and sped off in my boxers. Barefoot, hair still damp, my heart hammered all the way to my brother Chris's house. About 40 minutes away, my phone buzzed repeatedly, calls and texts from Lynn, but I ignored them. I was too shaken, verging on tears as I drove. When I finally parked in Chris's driveway, I forced myself to check the messages. They were all along the lines of, "Ben, where are you? What happened? And why did you leave like that?" Like she was playing innocent. If it was an act, it was an insanely cruel one. Chris is 4 years older, an ex-cop turned security specialist, living with his wife, Rebecca, and their 2 kids, though the kids happened to be at a sleepover that weekend. They were understandably shocked to see me standing on their doorstep in boxers. No shoes, hair dripping, and an expression like I'd seen a ghost. I told Chris we'd had a big fight, that Lynn had become aggressive, and I needed a place to crash. He asked if I needed to call the police. At that moment, my mind whirled. Part of me did want official help, but I also felt ashamed, guilty, and afraid they'd just say it was a domestic dispute or that I was overreacting. Lynn had never physically harmed me, yet, so I stayed. Chris's couch was lumpy but better than returning to that house. However, sleep eluded me. I kept imagining Lynn standing at the foot of the couch or behind the curtains. Every creak the house made jolted me awake. Around 4 a.m., I finally drifted off, only to be woken at 6 by the sensation of being watched again. When I opened my eyes, my heart almost jumped out of my throat. Lynn's face was pressed against the window just behind Chris's couch. Her eyes were wide, and there was a drool running down the glass. She wore a grin so intense that her lips appeared painfully stretched. I froze, our gazes locked. Unlike the other times, I felt more anger than fear. She'd followed me. She'd been outside who knows how long, just peering in. I leapt up and slammed my palm against the glass. "Lynn, what the hell? Go home," I yelled. She didn't react. Her grin stayed exactly the same, but her eyes flicked toward the sound of Chris and Rebecca hurrying downstairs, probably alerted by my shout. Then she began to close her mouth, like a mechanical doll winding down. Chris and Rebecca called my name, and I glanced over at them for a split second. When I turned back, Lynn was gone. No footprints, no sign of her, just 2 parallel streaks of saliva on the window. Chris came outside with me to check. We found an indentation in the damp soil, maybe from her shoes, but no distinct prints. It still might have been an animal for all the difference it made. Chris asked if I was sure it was Lynn. I swore up and down it was. Rebecca, concerned, offered me breakfast, but my stomach was twisted in knots. I called out of work that day. Chris tried gently prying more details out of me. I admitted Lynn had been acting really weird, but I didn't elaborate on how horrifyingly unnatural her behavior had become. My brother's a rational guy, ex-cop, as I mentioned. He's used to real threats, but I wasn't sure he could wrap his head around this. At some point, I realized I had to call Lynn or at least respond. Checking my phone, I saw she'd left dozens of texts, all worried sounding. "Ben, come home? Ben, I'm so worried. Can we please talk?" None said anything like, "Haha, did I scare you?" Or, "I'm sorry about last night." It was all just innocent, concerned wife stuff. A swirl of contradictory emotions churned in me. I still loved her. My vow echoed in my mind, in sickness and in health. Wasn't it my responsibility to help her if she was having a severe mental break? But how do you help someone who can hide in trunks and scuttle across floors, grinning like a demon? Chris, seeing my turmoil, suggested we return to the house together in the morning. We'll calmly talk to Lynn, see if we can figure out what's going on. If she's violent or refuses to speak, we can drive her to a hospital, he reasoned. I appreciated that he wasn't just brushing me off. I agreed. That evening, though I could barely sleep, every time I closed my eyes, I remembered Lynn's face at the window. Part of me was certain she was still somewhere close. The next day, after breakfast, Chris and I drove to my house. My stomach twisted the whole ride. Lynn's car wasn't in the driveway. The front door stood slightly open, which set off alarm bells. Chris, an ex-cop, knew to be cautious. We stepped in. The house felt hollow. No lights, all curtains drawn, and an immediate foul odor that made me want to gag. Think rotting meat or stagnant water. Chris wrinkled his nose. Dude, is something dead in here? I shrugged, fear coiling in my gut. I have only been gone since last night. But yeah, it reeks. We did a quick sweep of the first floor. Living room, empty but messy. The couch was pulled a few inches off from its normal spot, like something had crawled behind it. Kitchen, also empty. The fridge door was slightly ajar, but no sign of life. The place looked neglected, as if we'd left it for weeks, not a day. Then we headed upstairs. On the steps, we crunched over shards of glass. I looked up and saw that one of our wedding photos, the one hanging on the wall of the staircase, had been shattered. The frame dangled crookedly, glass pieces littering the steps. My heart sank as I remembered how happy we looked in that photo. We reached the bedroom. I planned to grab clothes so I could crash at Chris's for a while until we figured things out. But the rotten smell was stronger. With each step, my dread mounted. In the bedroom, the bed was unmade, the blankets tossed aside like someone left in a hurry. The old trunk at the foot of the bed sat wide open, empty. My eyes drifted to the closet door, which was cracked open. That's where the smell was coming from. I approached, swallowing bile. Then I slowly opened the closet. What I saw made me recoil in horror, nearly collapsing to my knees. On the floor was a neat arrangement of eyeballs, at least a dozen, various sizes, some as large as a quarter, others smaller like marbles. They were all in pairs, each pair lined up next to the next in a row, the carpeting soaked in congealed blood. Flies buzzed around them. Chris choked, stepping back. Jesus Christ, he managed. Where the hell did those come from? I couldn't answer. My brain spun. They're from animals, I told myself, noticing some were definitely too big to be a rodent. Maybe a cat, a small dog. But that meant Lynn had been collecting them? I closed the closet door reflexively, as if that could block out the memory. My arm shook as I turned the knob. Chris was ghost white, heading out into the hall for fresher air. I followed him, wishing I could unread that horrifying sight. We exchanged horrified glances. We need to get out. We should call the police, Chris said, voice trembling. I nodded, mouth dry. But before we could move, I sensed something behind me. A prickle on the back of my neck. Slowly, I turned. That's when I noticed a slight movement under our bed, visible through the doorway. I don't know why I didn't just run. Maybe some twisted sense of responsibility or an urge to see if it really was Lynn. My feet carried me forward, just enough to look inside the bedroom again. Sure enough, I glimpsed a figure curled on her side, half beneath the bed frame. It was Lynn, but she looked even more gaunt, as if she hadn't slept or eaten properly for days. Her eyes were impossibly wide. Her lips were parted in an awful grin, the corners of her mouth cracked and flecked with dried blood. Her hands were tucked under her chin, shaking with excitement, like she was barely containing some wild, joyous energy. Lynn, I whispered, my voice shaking. Baby, what's going on? Come out, okay? We can get you help. She made a soft hiccuping sound, her shoulders bobbing. Her eyes flicked between me and Chris, who was peeking around from the hallway. Then she giggled. It was a raspy, broken giggle, as though forced through a raw throat. I raised my hands in a placating gesture. Her entire body seemed to quiver in response, especially her fingertips, which were bright red with fresh blood. Are you hurt? I blurted, stepping closer. She shook her head too quickly, that grin intensifying. Her breathing sounded wet, ragged. Then, in a flash of movement, She slid out from under the bed, brandishing a large shard of broken glass. My gut twisted. She must have taken it from the shattered frame. Chris shouted, "Watch it! She's armed." I stumbled backward, trying to shield myself. Lynn lunged with terrifying speed, slashing at my forearm. Pain flared, blood spilling. I gasped and staggered back, clutching my arm. My wife's eyes sparkled with delight. She hissed, turning to face Chris. He held out his hands, maybe thinking he could reason with her, but she charged, swiping at him. The glass barely missed his chest, snagging his sleeve. "Lynn, stop!" I shouted. She froze for a millisecond, looking at me with a bizarre mixture of anger and longing, like she couldn't decide whether to attack me or hug me. Then she inhaled, shoulders trembling, and let out a jagged laugh. We took our chance, darting out of the bedroom. She sprinted after us, footsteps pounding. We hit the stairs. I practically jumped half the flight in 2 leaps. Chris was right behind me. At the bottom, I yanked the front door open, felt her weight crash into my back. Her arms latched around my neck, that wet laughter in my ear. Somehow I twisted free. She raked the glass across my back as she fell, a fiery sting blossoming. Chris was on the phone with 911, breathless, telling them about the assault. I half limped, half ran to my car. Through the rearview mirror, I saw Lynn standing in the open doorway, her chest heaving, grin still plastered on her face. She made no move to follow, just stood there, hair wild, eyes glinting. Then we sped off. Chris drove us straight to the ER, where I got stitches for the gash on my arm, 11 stitches, and 3 more for the smaller cut on my back. Chris's arm was only bruised. At the hospital, a couple of cops arrived to take our statements. We told them about Lynn's violent behavior, how she'd cut me, how she was seemingly unhinged. They promised to send a patrol car to our address and search for her, but we knew Lynn might vanish if she wanted to. She was cunning in all these peak incidents. The police took it seriously, though. My injuries, plus Chris being an ex-cop, gave us credibility. They advised me to stay with a friend or relative and consider filing a restraining order. But a piece of paper wouldn't stop her from creeping around corners. Even if they locked her up for a psychiatric hold, what if she fooled them? She could fake normalcy around others. She'd done it with me plenty of times, acting sweet and rational until the next horrifying lunge. I spent the next night at a motel an hour away, my body aching from stitches, my mind racing with nightmares. I left the lights on, phone in hand. Around midnight, I got a call from an unfamiliar number. I answered, voice trembling. It was Marianne, Lynn's mother. We'd barely spoken in the entire time I'd known Lynn. She'd always been distant, borderline hostile. "Benjamin," she said, her voice clipped. "I heard from the police that Lynn is missing, and that you're pressing charges." I swallowed. I'm not pressing charges yet, but I had to report that she attacked me. She's not well. A silence, then a shaky exhale. "Listen carefully. I'm not the warm and supportive type, so I won't pretend to be. But if Lynn's truly exhibiting the behavior I suspect, you must do whatever it takes to keep yourself safe." Her tone sent chills through me. "You know something about this, don't you?" I demanded. "What's happening to Lynn?" "I warned her this might happen," Marian said quietly. "It runs in my side of the family. The women sometimes develop episodes. They become fixated, see things in the shadows. Some of us manage to hide it better than others." I blinked, confused and angry. "Hide what? This is beyond any normal mental illness." "She's collecting eyeballs. For God's sake." Marian made a strangled noise. "I'm sorry. I truly am. But once this escalates, there's little hope. The best advice I can give is to get far away. She'll always find you, though. They always do." Before I could press for more, she hung up. I sat there, phone in my lap, heart pounding. Marianne's cryptic admission both alarmed and enraged me. So Lynn had a family history of disturbing behavior. But that didn't explain the supernatural aspects, like her inhuman crawling or how she vanished from trunks. Out of desperation, I reached out to Sam, Lynn's old college friend. Sam apologized for being out of contact and said he'd uncovered an old letter Lynn had written him months ago but never mailed. He'd found it among some documents. He forwarded a scanned copy. Sam, I keep having these dreams, the ones I told you about. In them, I see people I know, Mom, Dad, sometimes Ben, and they smile at me in ways that make my skin crawl. It's not a human smile. I'm terrified I'll start smiling like that too. Ever since Dad died, I felt something wrong inside me, like a door opening in my mind that I can't close. Mom pretended it was just grief, but I know better. Sometimes at night I wake up and think I see her in the hallway. My mother, but her eyes look too big. Then she's gone. Am I cursed? Or am I crazy? I don't want to turn into whatever she might be, but I feel it creeping up on me. Like I can't breathe. Like something's watching me from inside my own head, waiting for me to slip up. Lynn. Reading that made my blood run cold. The nightmares, the big eyes, the inhuman smile. She'd been fighting a sense of dread and possible mental torment for ages. Something about Marianne suggested a generational curse, or maybe a shared psychosis. But it still didn't explain how she'd begun scuttling on all fours and collecting eyes. I realized, though, that Lynn must have spent years trying to hide her downward spiral, only to lose control recently. In a twisted sense, I felt pity. She might be as frightened as I was, even though her behavior was undeniably monstrous. Over the next 2 days, I stayed holed up in that motel. I barely slept. I jumped at every noise outside. Police updates were minimal. They hadn't located Lynn, but they'd keep searching. My brother insisted I come back to his place, but I refused, not wanting to endanger him and his family. I'd blocked Lynn's phone number, but one night around 3 a.m., my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I found you. My stomach flipped. Another text arrived. Image attached. I opened the file, heart hammering. It was a blurry, dark photo of a single eye, unmistakably Lynn's. Even in the low resolution, I recognized her distinct pupil shape and the faint scar on her brow from a childhood accident. It was as though she was sending me a picture of her own eye, or something she'd harvested. The thought made me shudder. The next night, about 3 a.m., I couldn't sleep. I was perched on the edge of the motel bed, scanning the windows. Suddenly, I heard the softest knock at the door, followed by a giggle. My blood froze. I tiptoed to look through the peephole. It was too dark to see anything, but I heard a faint scraping near the bottom of the door, like someone was scratching it. My mouth went dry. Then, a slam jolted me backward. The door rattled. I braced it with a chair. Another slam, more forceful, and a rasping laugh that sent chills across my skin. Ben! A voice called. Open up. The voice was husky, like she'd spent hours screaming or moaning. I clutched the bedside lamp, the only weapon at hand. The chain on the door rattled a third time, then snapped under the repeated impacts. The door swung open, chair toppling. Lynn stood there, hair disheveled, wearing a filthy t-shirt stained with questionable dark patches. Her lips curved into that horrid smile, teeth parted in a silent snarl. For a moment, she just stared at me, chest heaving. Her eyes shone with some unnatural brightness. I swallowed, lamp raised. Don't come any closer, I warned. She cocked her head, that grin broadening, revealing smears of dried blood in the corners of her mouth. You left me, Ben, she whispered. You ran away. My throat tightened. You're not, Lynn. I managed. Please, let me help you. You're sick. She emitted a low chuckle and lunged at me, nails raking across my forearm. I yelped, swinging the lamp. The heavy base struck her shoulder with a thud. She staggered, letting out a hiss, but seemed barely fazed. In a burst of adrenaline, I dashed past her, trying to get to the open door. She spun, grabbing the back of my shirt, and slammed me into the motel dresser. Stars danced in my vision. She advanced, breath ragged, that grin plastered on her face. Her nails dug into my skin. Stay with me, she purred, voice warbling with some twisted glee. Summoning my last ounce of strength, I kicked out, landing a blow to her shin. She howled, loosening her grip. I scrambled free, leaving the lamp behind. Out in the hallway, I screamed for help. The motel manager popped his head out, eyes wide. "Call the police," I yelled. Behind me, Lynn emerged from the doorway, moving fast on all fours again. She let out a guttural cackle, then paused, hearing sirens in the distance. Maybe someone else had already dialed 911. She stared at me, that grin melting into a furious glare. Blood trickled from her lip where I must have hit her with the lamp. For a heartbeat, we locked eyes. Something flashed in her gaze. Recognition? Sorrow? Then she scrambled back into the motel room, leapt through the broken window with an explosion of glass, and disappeared into the night. I slumped to the floor, panting, arms stinging from fresh claw marks. That was the last I saw of her that night. When the cops showed up, I gave another frantic statement. They found blood drops, shattered glass, signs of forced entry, but no Lynn. They insisted I go to the hospital to stitch up the new lacerations on my arm. "Sir, do you want to file a restraining order?" an officer asked. "We can't do much else but keep an eye out for her. We have enough to consider her armed and dangerous." I just nodded numbly. The trauma was too overwhelming. Even a restraining order felt pointless. If Lynn wanted to get to me, she'd find a way. She was always a step ahead, showing up exactly when I let my guard down. Late that morning, my phone buzzed again with Marianne's number. I debated ignoring it, but curiosity won. "You're still alive then?" she said, voice strangely flat. "Yes, she attacked me at a motel last night. I barely escaped." Marianne sighed. "I warned you. What do I do?" Pleaded. "You must have a clue. You said it runs in the family. How have you handled it? You're obviously not creeping around collecting eyeballs." A heavy pause. "Because I never let it take over entirely. Because I had help. But it's not something I can guide you through over the phone. And you're not my husband. You're worthless." I spat, tears of frustration welling up. "You let your daughter fall into this madness without a word of warning to me. Her husband." Her voice trembled. "If you're wise, you'll leave this town, change your name, everything. She will find you, but maybe you can outrun her. For a while." "Damn you!" I hissed and hung up. My anger overshadowed my fear at that moment. Desperate, I tried combing through old boxes Lynn kept in our attic. Chris accompanied me to get them. One box contained some old diaries, partial college transcripts, and a few psychological evaluation forms from years ago, presumably from when Lynn had a short stay in a mental health facility. Scouring them revealed notes about acute stress reaction after her father's death, references to possible visual hallucinations, but no official diagnosis of psychosis. She'd apparently done well in therapy, finishing the recommended sessions. Then she'd left the state for graduate school. An older slip of paper, though, described episodes of sleepwalking, catatonia mania, which I'd never heard from Lynn. The words genetic predisposition appeared in the margins, scribbled by a counselor. I pictured Marianne's stony face, her cryptic warnings. Clearly, Lynn had buried this part of her life from me, wanting to appear stable. Now all the puzzle pieces pointed to a nightmarish scenario. Some mental or supernatural condition triggered by emotional strain or inheritance, letting out a monstrous side of the afflicted. Lynn had snapped, and I was her main target or obsession. At Chris's urging, I relocated again, renting a short-term place in another county under an alias. I changed my phone number and told only Chris and the police. I started living like a fugitive, jumping at every shadow. Nights were the worst. I'd lie in bed, remembering how she peeked around corners, imagining her face suddenly appearing by the window. Sometimes I'd check the locks 4 or 5 times. I'd see a silhouette in the yard, freak out, only to discover it was a tree. My mind was unraveling. Chris, dealing with the aftershock of seeing me so paranoid, insisted on hooking me up with a small security camera system for the rental house, connected to an app on my phone. "At least you can see if she's outside," he reasoned. But no matter how advanced the setup, I still woke at 3 a.m. in a cold sweat, half sure she'd be standing in the hallway. I even started sleeping with a knife by my bed. If she came again, I had no illusions about her intention. She wanted me to join her or die. One night, around 2 a.m., I was doom scrolling on my phone when an email popped up in my brand new, rarely used Gmail account. Sender: no reply, laugh at? Subject: don't forget me. My breath caught. I opened it. Can you hear me breathing outside your window? I never left you, Ben. Attached was a photo of the front of my rental place, shot at night. Through the window, you could see me, hunched over my phone. The angle suggested the photographer was standing right outside, in the bushes. My heart was hammered. I lurched to the window, flung back the curtain. Darkness. Empty street. My phone camera feed from the security system showed nothing except a flickering streetlight. But that didn't reassure me. Lynn was cunning. She could slip between blind spots or cut the power. I didn't sleep at all that night. 2 days later, the tension snapped. I woke from a brief nap on the sofa to the sound of my phone's security app alerting me. Motion detected. Front door. My pulse skyrocketed. I checked the feed. The camera was glitching, lines of static dancing across the screen. Then I glimpsed a shape, a shadow shifting across the lens. A second later, the motion alert repeated, motion detected, back window. Realizing she might have circled around, I grabbed a bat I kept by the sofa. My phone buzzed, another motion alert. The system was going haywire. She's here, my mind screamed. She's at every door. Suddenly, a heavy bang on the back window shattered the silence. I jumped, letting out a startled cry. The window rattled a second time. Then a faint hiss, followed by that all-too-familiar giggle. I forced myself to the kitchen, flung on the light, and saw a silhouette pressed against the glass. Lynn's eyes, glinting under the pale beam. Her mouth parted in that grotesque grin, showing gums and teeth. She started tapping the glass with her fingertips in a bizarre rhythm, like a psycho lullaby. Ben, she rasped. Let me in. I shook my head, tears burning my eyes. Stop, Lynn. You need help. I'm begging you. Let the cops or doctors help you. She giggled, pressing her forehead to the glass. A smudge of blood or dark fluid streaked it. You love me, she said quietly. You promised. A wave of sadness and terror overwhelmed me. I do love you, I whispered. That's why I can't let you in until you get treatment. Or, she slammed her palm on the glass, cutting me off. Cracks spiderwebbed outward. My heart jumped. She must have been holding something heavy or sharp. Alarms beeps from my phone. The window sensor triggered. Then I heard the glass start to buckle. If she forced her way in, I'd have no choice but to fight her, to protect myself. My wife, the woman I pledged to be with forever. I dialed 911, shouting into the phone for immediate police assistance. Meanwhile, Lynn hammered the window again, a chunk of glass breaking free. Her head slid into the gap, hair snagging on the jagged edges. She stared at me, grin unwavering. A rivulet of blood trickled from her scalp. She either didn't notice or didn't care. Lynn, no, I cried. She let out a growl, yanking her head back to free it. Shards cut her. She laughed as the blood dripped. I watched in horror as she reached an arm through. I stumbled backward, bat in hand, tears streaming. The phone fell from my grasp, still connected to 911. Please hurry, I shouted to the operator, voice cracking. Lynn's hand fumbled for the window latch. I swung the bat, slamming it down on her forearm to keep her from undoing the lock. She recoiled, cursing in a guttural tone. Then she looked me dead in the eye, eyes blazing with a mix of pain and rage. For a moment, I thought she'd lunge further. Instead, she withdrew her arm, panting. Blood spattered the sill. She pressed her face to the broken pane again, smiling, though tears were in her eyes. A flicker of that old Lynn, my Lynn, seemed to surface. You hurt me, she mumbled, voice trembling. I only wanted to see you up close. I was sobbing openly now. You attacked me, Lynn. You tried to kill me. Sirens approached in the distance. Lynn's expression shifted to panic. She twisted away from the window, stumbling into the night. I sank to the floor, trembling. Police arrived moments later, but again, she was gone by the time they searched the yard. I told them everything from the texts to the forced entry attempt. They took photos, recorded statements, and set up a neighborhood watch. As usual, no sign of her the next day. Just a trail of blood leading into the woods behind the house, which ended abruptly. It's been a week since that last break-in. I've reinforced the windows. The police are on high alert. Chris checks in on me daily, urging me to come back to his place. But I refuse, not wanting to drag him into a face-to-face confrontation with Lynn again. I stare at the walls, phone always at hand, waiting. I half expect her to send more cryptic emails or show up behind the shower curtain. The dread is constant, an ache in my bones. I can't eat or sleep properly. I jump at the slightest noises. 3 nights ago, I received one last message from a random email address, presumably hers. "I'm sorry I scared you. I'm sorry you're hurt. I'm sorry I have to do it again. I can't stop the urges. Please don't hate me, Ben. I love you. I love you so much. Lynn." That's all it said, no photos this time. It shattered me, because I know there's a shred of her in there, possibly begging for help. But how do I save her if she's determined to slip in and out of the shadows, collecting animal eyes and laughing at the sight of her own blood? I've started journaling this entire experience, collecting everything, the videos from my security cams, the hospital reports, the text messages, the letter from Lynn's friend. Part of me hopes that if the worst happens, if she kills me or if I snap and kill her, someone will read this record and understand. I also keep remembering our wedding day, the photo she shattered. She was so beautiful, so happy in that white dress. She didn't like horror movies because they gave her nightmares. Now she is the horror stalking my life. As I wrap up this account, I can't pretend it's resolved. I'm living day to day, waiting for another peek from behind a corner or under a bed, for the next unnerving email or text. The cops say they'll keep searching. I say they'll never find her unless she wants to be found. Some nights, I stand at the window, looking out at the darkness, half expecting to see her silhouette. Sometimes I do see something, a shape that might be a tree or might be Lynn's crouched form. Sometimes I think I hear giggling in the wind. My mind might be playing tricks, or maybe she's truly there, savoring my fear. Do I still love her? Yes, that's the tragedy. I love the woman I married, not this monstrous version. But there's enough overlap that I can't separate them anymore. Her eyes, her smell, her voice. They all belong to that same person, no matter how twisted she's become. Do I want to kill her? Of course not. But part of me wonders if that's the only way out. Another part hopes that maybe one day she'll show up, peaceful and calm, ready to be taken to a psych facility. Wishful thinking, right? Until then, I live with my phone on July 24th, my security system on high, and a creeping suspicion that each day could be my last. Sometimes, I wonder if I should flee the country altogether, but Marianne's words haunt me. She'll always find you. They always do. So that's my story. That's how my wife went from a sweet, easily frightened soul to something that lurks behind doors, scuttles across floors, and slams bathroom doors so hard the mirrors shake. If you're reading this, maybe you think I'm insane. I think so too if I hadn't experienced it firsthand. And if you ever feel a pair of eyes on you in the dead of night, if you ever sense a presence just around the corner, if you glimpse a grin in the reflection of a darkened window, well, maybe it's just your imagination. But for me, it's Lynn. She's out there, watching, smiling, waiting for the next time I let my guard down. And I have to stay vigilant or risk losing what's left of my mind and my life. I wish I could give you closure, a final confrontation, a cure for her condition, a ritual that banishes the family curse. But no, real life doesn't wrap up neatly. Some nightmares drag on. And so I stay here, armed, exhausted, and desperate, with a single question echoing in my mind. Will she ever truly let me go? Or maybe the real question is, will I ever be able to let her go? For now, the story ends here, suspended in terror and uncertainty. Lynn has vanished into the night again, leaving behind only bloodstains, shattered windows, and the memory of those wide, unblinking eyes peering out from dark corners. I can still feel them on me, even when I'm alone, especially when I'm alone.